Scars. 1. The boy was dragged into the cave. The reason was unknown, nor did he know the people who were dragging him away. In truth, the boy didn't know who he himself was. He had been roaming the fields when he was grabbed by men he didn't know and dragged into a cave in the mountains. Once deep inside, the boy was tied up. The men made sure that the chains wrapped around his limbs would render him completely immobile before finally retreating. In the dark, he cried and shouted for a while, but no one came to his aid. When his cries had wound down, the boy heard a rustling sound behind him. It was coming towards him. The boy survived on raw meat and greens. He slept curled up where he was tied. He also excreted there. Occasionally, the boy was dragged outside the cave by the chains that bound him. This happened once every few days, or it could have been once every few weeks. No sunlight reached the interior of the cave. Whenever he was dragged outside the cave, the light was so bright that it hurt him. When he was raised by the chains into the air, the boy would cry out in pain and fear. He would be dragged off somewhere and thrown into a body of icy water that glittered and undulated. The boy did not know how to swim, but his tied up hands and legs prevented him from swimming anyway. Shouting and flailing, he would begin to sink in defeat when suddenly something would yank the chain again and he would be flung into the air, dragged through forest and mountain trails, and tossed into the cave once more. Inside the cave, where the boy had air to breathe and steady ground beneath him, the boy felt a kind of relief. Flashing sunlight or suffocating darkness, the blinding sky or the damp and moldy air of the cave, there was nothing in between for the boy, and no foretelling of what would happen when. It came to the boy once a month, pierced his bones and sucked at his marrow. It was impossible for the boy to see the passage of day or night, and therefore he wouldn't know if a month had passed or a year. Though he could not calculate how much time was going by, the visit of it was the single thing that was regular and predictable in his life. The boy didn't know what it was. He didn't even know what it looked like. It seemed to writhe in the darkness. It was large, strong, scary, and brought great suffering. It would insert a sharp, hard thing into the boy's vertebrae and suck, starting near his backside above his pelvis and working its way up, vertebrae by vertebrae, towards the boy's neck. The order of how it happened was always the same. The small white dot of the cave entrance would be covered by a sudden black mass. A rustling, a squelch. Damp, musty, stiff feathers would press down on the boy's wrists and ankles. Then a sharp, hard, and indescribably terrifying and painful object punctured his vertebrae. After it left, the boy wouldn't be able to move for a while out of pain and fear. When he'd finally make an effort to get up, the feeling that his backbone was shattering would make him cry out. There was no intended meaning or direction to the boy's screams. The boy had no family he knew of. He didn't know who his mother or father was, did not remember where he had come from or where he had been wandering, and what faint traces of memory he had were scattered into the depths of oblivion. Despite this, the boy prayed that someone, whoever that may be, as long as it was someone, came to rescue him from this cave. They would take him wherever it may be, as long as it wasn't here, to a place where this pain and darkness did not exist. He prayed with all his drained, wasted heart. Of course, no one came to his rescue. Since no one knew the boy existed, no one realized that the boy had disappeared. 2. Alone in the cave, the boy tested how far he could move from the stake that held his chains to the ground. To the rhythm of his clanging chains, as he walked, he mumbled in a low voice and hummed something resembling a song. This wasn't from some emotion like joy. It was merely his futile attempt to somehow fill the repugnant space that was this empty darkness and the hours of dread. When his chains hit the cave wall and he saw a small spark, it was, to the boy in his darkest and emptiest time in his young life, the happiest moment he had ever experienced. Yearning to see the small but beautiful light once more, he pulled his chain again and again, hitting the walls and ground until the light of another spark allowed him a glimpse of a small insect. Since being dragged into this cave, this was the first time the boy had seen a creature other than himself living in there. Not that he was sure if it was living or dead, as he hadn't had a good look at it. He saw the insect for less than a second, a truly brief interval. The insect was slowly, diligently crawling up the wall of the cave. Before the chain had struck the rock, the insect had been crawling up the wall, and with the spark, it had briefly cowered, then continued its way through the familiar dark at a slow, leisurely pace. They both lived in the same cave, but the world of the boy and the world of the insect were so different. While the boy had finally found another life form with him, it was completely disinterested in the pain, expectations, or hope the boy held. The boy smashed his chains again and again against the rocks, but he never saw the insect again. That was the first time he sobbed in earnest. Not the cries of someone driven mad with fear, but the tears of someone who understood and was saddened by their own loneliness, the tears of a human being. 3. Every boy who manages to survive in this world grows into a young man. As time passed, the boy felt the chains grow shorter somehow. When he extended his arms or legs during his slumber, the feeling of steel digging into his flesh or the pull of chains would jolt him awake. When he was dragged outside the cave and thrown through the too bright air that was like crashing through sheets of ice, he could feel as he struggled and resisted that it was also struggling with him now. One fateful day, the boy was again thrown into the freezing water head first. It bit into the boy's legs as if to break them, plunging him several times into the water and back out again. On the last plunge, he sunk all the way to the bottom of the water before he was picked up by it and thrown into the darkness of the cave again. It once more shoved its hard and sharp thing into the boy's neck. The boy thought he was finally done for. He clearly felt the flesh on his neck tear and the relentless, painful, sharp thing digging in between his bones. Thinking his neck would be cut in half, he closed his eyes. When he woke, he was still alive. He could not turn his head or move his arms and legs. It took much longer than usual to recover, and there was none of the raw meat or greens that had been placed around him like before. The boy trembled from hunger and fear as he lay crouched in the dark, not knowing when it would return to cut off his head. It did not appear for a long time. When he could finally move his limbs again, the boy realized he was no longer a helpless child anymore. The boy who had become a young man started to latch onto the small glimmer of hope of leaving the cave on his own. That possibility stirred in the movement of his limbs and gradually solidified into a plan. 4. Just like the other times he was dragged away, the youth was one day being thrown into the outside world again. Soaring through the air, it had him in his jaws. When the cave disappeared over the horizon, the youth suddenly swung his limbs. An unplanned, compulsive act. It hadn't expected the boy's movement. When the chains tied around the boy slammed into it, it let out a cry the likes of which the youth had never heard before and dropped him from its grasp. The youth fell through the air. He collided into something hard. He lost consciousness. When he woke, a red sun hung over a forest. Having not seen such a thing for so long, the youth gazed at the sun as its red light bled into the horizon, and the youth rose. His whole body felt shattered. His head ached, but he was alive. He still had the manacles on his wrists and shackles on his ankles, but the chain attached to them wasn't tied to anything anymore and simply dangled there. The only thing he wore on his body were those manacles and shackles, scored onto his naked body, on his arms and legs and vertebrae, and both rack of ribs, were 120 large triangular scars. Toward the melting crimson light that was spreading into the sky, he turned and began walking. His movements were slow. For too long, he had become used to solely crouching in a cave or struggling midair or underwater. To stand and walk on his own two legs was like any other distant memory he had of his childhood, a faint dream from long ago. Not to mention all the places he injured when he plummeted from the sky. The manacles and shackles impeded his movements. When he got tired, he tried bending down and crawling, or grabbing a branch to support himself upright for a bit, trying to stand steadily on his own 2 feet, slowly learning once more how to use his own body. He didn't know where the raw meat that he had often eaten had come from. but he knew how to identify edible greens and fruit from trees. He grabbed whatever he could get his hands on and chewed, continuing to walk towards the unknown. This was an escape. Tired, yes, and in pain, but he was free, which was why, even though he didn't know where he was going, he rushed towards it. Never did he want to be caught again. That must not happen. Going back to the darkness of the cave would mean it would finally kill him. Of that, he was certain. 5. When he reached a village, the villagers stared at him, frozen in place. Seeing his naked body, the mothers covered the eyes of their children, but once they glimpsed the scars on his back, their mouths that had been opening to speak clamped shut. No one approached him. All they did was stare with eyes filled with fear. No one tried to help him, but on the other hand, no one ran away, cursed him, or tried to banish him. In the almost shockingly stark silence, they stared wide-eyed at him. The last time he had met another person was a very long time ago, and even back then, he had never met so many people at once, and the sight of so many people concentrating on him was something he could never have imagined before. Their stony faces and wide-open eyes, and the mysterious silence that ruled over it all, suppressed his courage. As he awkwardly stood there and stared around him, the villagers turned away one by one and disappeared into their homes. After a while, there were only a few left, who continued to keep their distance while silently staring before they, too, disappeared. Soon enough, he was alone at the edge of the village. He was truly at a loss as to what to do. At first there had been too many people, and now there were none. It was too bright. No rock wall that had defined the boundaries of his world. No chain on a stake driven into the ground. He thought about how, after being catapulted through the icy air and tossed into cold water, the cave he had been thrown back into had felt safe. For a brief moment, he missed the familiar darkness of that place. Then suddenly, people were crowding around him again. Maintaining their distance like before, they appeared in ones and twos, staring at him. This time, the people were quietly conversing amongst themselves. He had a hard time reading their expressions, and their sheer number continued to overwhelm him, making him uncertain of what to do. A voice was heard over the low rumblings of the crowd. "All right, it's all right. Get out of the way, will ya? Ah, here we go, there he is." The loud voice had come from a bald, middle-aged man. Led by a young man through the crowd, he kept blustering and shouting as he approached. The bald man, when he approached the edge of the crowd nearest to the youth from the cave, whispered something to the young companion, who turned and disappeared back into the crowd. The older man, however, kept shouting things like, "It's all right," or "Ah, here we go," as he came up to the youth. When he extended his hand, the youth took a step back in surprise. But the bald man, smiling gamely, took another step and slipped his hand onto the chain dangling from the youth's manacles. He gently pulled. "All right, then, here we go. Nothing more to see. Go about your business, everyone. We're all good to go." It had been so long since he had heard the sound of another person's voice that it wasn't heartening. It was merely strange. He couldn't understand half of the words the bald man was saying. But just as he had cowered instinctively in the cave when stretching out his arms and legs and the chains had pulled them back, he cowered now when the man pulled lightly at his chain. With a friendly smile on his face, the man held onto the chain as he approached the youth and placed his hand on his shoulder. The white and plump hand disappeared into the tangles of the youth's hair, which had grown as wild as a bush. As if already familiar with his body, the hand crept to the scar on his neck bone where it had ripped into and sucked, and the man pressed down hard. The youth froze. The fear when it had pierced his vertebrae, the absolute terror that he may die, and the pain, it all came flooding back. All right, look, nothing more to see here. Everybody go about your day now. Hey, step aside, will you?" The bald man kept speaking his loud voice as he led the youth by the chain, his hand still on the youth's neck. Unable to suppress or swallow the scream that burst from him, the youth was dragged away by the man. 6. The man gave him water, food, and clothing. Having known only raw meat and greens as sustenance, the smell of cooked food was strange to him. But once he put it in his mouth, he couldn't stop until he had devoured it all. He had filled his stomach and nodded off when the sound of clanging woke him up with a start. As he saw the bald man approaching his wrist with a large tool, he screamed and struggled against the hands of the other men who held him down, helpless. The bald man cut off the manacle on the youth's left wrist and the shackles on his ankles. The right hand manacle he left for some reason, but because he had taken the chain off the ring, it didn't dangle awkwardly like before. The youth looked down at his wrists and ankles. The feeling of heavy steel was repugnant, but he was used to it, along with the calluses over the scraped, even scarred flesh where the metal had touched. The sudden lightness in his arms and legs was peculiar to him. Rest a bit, yeah? You've got to start earning your keep from tomorrow. For some reason, the bald man seemed gleeful as he spoke his words with a wide grin, all incomprehensible to the youth. The man, sensing that the youth couldn't understand him, smiled even wider as he shut the door to the little hut he had put the youth in. The youth sat for a while in the peace and calm. At first, he was afraid, but because nothing bad was happening, he gradually began to relax. On the dirt floor of the hut was a straw mat. Having only felt black rock against his bare body for as long as he could remember, that thin straw mat was as soft as cotton fluff to him. The hut was dim, but nothing like the absolute darkness of the cave. The air was warm and soft, lightly fragrant with fresh grass and earth. Between the straw of the thatched roof, the stars sparkled above. He thought of how he'd smashed his steel chains against the walls of the cave just to see a single spark. Had some giant trapped inside the cave of the night sky struck their chains against some unimaginably large wall to create the stars? Had they done it as a cry for help? Or to endure, somehow, the emptiness and darkness? He had no way of knowing. Whatever the reason they were banging their chains against the walls, the trapped giant, like the insect that had crawled by him, could only toss him a disinterested glance. That was his last thought before drifting off to sleep. 7. The bald man woke him up early in the morning. The man's many underlings had the youth's body and hair washed and his tangled locks cut off. Whenever the youth struggled in fear, the bald man pressed down with his fat white hand on the scar on the nape of the youth's neck. It was strange how well he knew how to make the youth obey. After the washing and the hair cutting, the bald man's followers slathered the youth's body in oils and put him in ornate trousers. He wasn't given anything to wear above his waist, so the scars on his arms and upper body were laid bare. The oils made the triangular scars on his body shine like threatening tattoos. After this preparation was over, the bald man fastened a chain to the cuff on the youth's right hand. The old chain had been rusted red and was heavy and awkward, but this new chain, while just as thick, was much lighter, its black sheen gleaming in the sun. The black color made him think of it, blocking the entrance to the cave, its stiff feathers. But because the bald man was now gently tugging at the chain, he came back to his senses and obediently began to walk as he was ordered. On foot, they eventually arrived in a large square in the middle of a village. At a gesture from the bald man, his followers drove pegs into the square and made a kind of fence. The bald man, chain in his hand, smiled as always while watching them work. The villagers started to arrive as the fence was being completed. The youth, like before, was standing at the overwhelming crowd in wonder. When they were fully surrounded by the crowd, the bald man detached the black chain from the youth's cuff and gave him a light push. Now, go fight. The youth couldn't understand him. He stood at the entrance, a gap in the wooden fence, and could only stare at the faces of the people gathered around and that of the bald man. The man grinned again. You idiot! Go, fight! Bite! Shoo! And he shoved him hard into the empty space inside the fence. The people around the fence roared in delight. So strange and loud was this sound to the youth that he recoiled in fear. When he raised his head, he found himself face to face with a large black dog that was foaming at the mouth and had murder in its eyes. Naturally, he had no idea this was a dog. It had been far too long since he had seen any kind of animal, wild or livestock, but its bloodshot eyes and the sharp fangs that glinted through the foam allowed him to instinctively understand what was happening. The youth looked behind him. The gap that the bald man had pushed him through was now blocked. Without taking his eyes off the dog's bloody stare, he started to shuffle sideways, step by slow step, and another step. Just as he turned his head to seek another escape, the black dog made a soundless leap for the youth's neck. As the dog's teeth arced through the air towards him, the youth felt the shockwave of every bone and joint breaking within him. Even in the painful throes of being shattered into 1,000 pieces, during that single leap he could still hear the sound of every individual break and crack, one after another. The dog's teeth, which aimed for his throat, and its claws, eager to rip his flesh, smashed against something hard, and the dog rebounded off, thwarted in its attack. After rolling on the ground, the dog righted itself and continued to growl. As the youth stood up to meet the dog's gaze again, he could detect within its bloodshot eyes a hint of hesitation. But the dog was sick. Following the dictates of the disease from deep within its brain, the dog, still foaming at the mouth, howled as it charged at the youth again. He couldn't remember what happened next. When he came to, the large black dog was nothing but a lump of leather and fur drenched in blood, tossed to the side on the dusty ground. The crowd roared. There were those who had hastily left, or turned around and threw up. Those who hadn't vomited or left were like the sick dog when it was alive, flashing their bloodshot eyes and making loud, incomprehensible noises and wildly clapping. The bald man came into the arena and bowed. More shouts and applause. As the youth stood there dazed, the man grabbed his arm and led him out. Only when the bald man's followers approached the youth and began to towel him off did the youth realize he was covered in his own sweat and the dog's blood. Good job. The bald man was all grins, deeply satisfied about something. You did well. Just keep doing what you do. Maybe show a bit more restraint next time, yeah? The man lifted his thick white hand and slapped it playfully on the nape of the youth's neck. The palm of his hand had pressed down precisely on the scar, but the contact had been quick and light, which made the youth feel less scared than before. From the people who had wiped away the sweat and blood came offerings of water and dried meat. He gulped down the water in a frenzy and chewed the salty, tough flesh and thought about how different the man's light and friendly touch just now had been from when he had pressed down hard on the scar the first time he led him away. He couldn't understand how, but on some level, he knew that he had been given a compliment by another human being for the first time. 8. He was taken village to village and entered into fights. The youth did not understand what was going on, but he was a good fighter. His opponent would be another big dog or captured wolf, sometimes a boar. Once he had to fight a bear. Whatever his opponent, the only things he could remember of the fights themselves were the fear and tension, the pain of his body shattering into pieces, and the piercing sound of breakage. Then, strangely enough, he would come to, and the beast would be lying with its neck broken or stomach ripped open, its guts spilled all over the ground. Restraint, my dear boy, restraint. The bald man, his pale and plump face stretched by an ear to ear grin, would chant the words like they were a mantra. It's all very fine and well to rip open your opponent when it's an animal, but if you do that to another man, the mess afterwards is such a fuss to clean up. Then the man would take a look at the youth's uncomprehending, staring face and toss him another bit of dried meat. A rank idiot you are. There's some way to teach you so you'd understand, all right. One day, the man brought over another man who had the same shining bald head but was about twice the size in muscle alone. Shaven completely, hair, beard, and even eyebrows. The muscular man with the shining face whispered something to the bald man before entering the arena and standing before the youth. Unsure of what to do, the youth simply stared at the man. The beasts he fought would have blood in their gaze, raise their hackles, or be foaming at the mouth with their claws unsheathed. Their intention to attack was clear, and there was nothing else to do other than get out of the way or defend yourself. But fighting a man was completely different. The completely shaven, muscled man was grinning like the bald man as he spread his arms wide in a friendly gesture and looked at the youth. Come over here, kid. Let's have some fun. The youth didn't know what this meant. He hesitated. A glance at the muscled man's smiling face, and then a glance at the bald man outside the fence who was watching them. The bald man kept grinning. Attack, you idiot! Attack him! He made punching gestures with his white, fat fists. The youth could understand that gesture, at least. This being the first time he was fighting a man. There was something about the situation that made him hold back at first, but in the end, he followed instructions and lunged at the bald, muscled man. The man stepped aside with an agility that belied his bulky appearance. The youth turned and lunged again. The older man deftly deflected him with his left palm. Momentum made the youth sprawl to the ground. The muscle man gripped the back of the youth's neck, freezing where he was. The moment the muscle man pressed down on the scars at the nape of his neck, he lost all ability to move. The muscled man grinned. He tossed the youth away like a doll. The youth slammed against the wooden fence. For a brief moment, his vision blacked out. As he came to and tried to get upright again, he realized his nose was bleeding. Standing now, he tried to get his wits back by shaking his head. By the time his eyes refocused, the muscled man was right in front of him. The youth had hardly a second to think before his opponent, in a gesture as if to stroke a child's head, spread his palm and slammed it into the youth's temple. The youth stumbled onto the ground again. Spitting out sand and blood, he stood up again. There had never been a fight that had progressed like this before. In anger, he charged at the man with his fists up. Like before, the man easily avoided him, even pressing down on the scar as the youth fell again of his own accord. The feeling that he was being mocked only further stoked his fury. But running at the man and making futile attempts at blows was only exhausting him. Face splattered with blood and sand, the youth swayed as he stood. He could barely breathe. The muscled man was still grinning as he looked on. "It's more tiring to miss and hit the air than it is to get some good punches in," he said. "Because it's not just the body that's exhausted, it's the mind." The youth didn't understand him. All he could see was that the man was making fun of him. Enraged, he forgot all about how tired and out of breath he was. Forming fists with his hands, he attacked once more. The man again evaded the youth's attacks. He waited for the youth to stumble again, then pressed his knee on the youth's back and brought his fist up to the youth's neck. The moment the youth felt the man's fist, his third knuckle specifically, graze the nape of his neck, the youth heard from somewhere the first, faint sound of breaking. Right before his fist could dig into the youth's neck, the muscled man stopped his movement. The youth caught his breath and waited. The sound stopped. Nothing happened. Slowly, the man stood up. He extended a hand, but the youth didn't take it. The youth stood up on his own. Seeing this, the muscled man, yet again, grinned. The youth could hear the other two men talking as he drank his water and chewed his dried meat. "As long as he doesn't realize that his opponent is attacking him, you're saying if we could delay the realization somehow? But think of what might go wrong. How? I'm telling you, it never fails to work." In the midst of their talk, the men would smile at the youth if they met his gaze, as if the two had made a prior agreement. The older bald man threw him another scrap of meat. The muscled man made a drinking gesture towards the youth. Seeing his perplexed expression, the muscled man laughed loudly. 9. A few days later, the youth was sent out to fight once more. But before he stepped into the empty arena, the bald man handed him a liquid in a leather pouch. Opening it without thinking, the youth averted his face from the sudden, sharp smell. The only liquid he'd known was water. The stuff in the pouch was definitely not water. He stared at the bald man. As always, he was grinning his grin, and this time he'd made drinking gestures, throwing his head back with his hand near his mouth. "Drink up, it's good for you. You've got to make lots of money, right?" The youth hesitated. The man came closer and grabbed his neck. The moment the youth was helpless, the man poured the stinging liquid in his mouth. The youth coughed and heaved, but the man managed to get almost half of it down his throat. "Perfect. Now go! Shoo!" Smirking, the pouch still in his hand, the man slapped the youth's back and shoved him into the arena. This time, the youth's opponent was a person, a young man with a fierce expression. His hair was shorn, there was a long scar on his forehead, and his eyes were long, angry slits. This ferocious young man bounded up to the youth. Thinking he was being attacked, the youth instinctively flinched. But just as his opponent came within striking distance, the man leaped away. His opponent, legs wide apart and swaying back and forth, would approach within an arm's length and jump back, approach and jump back, over and over. Watching his opponent do this made the youth feel dizzy. When the opponent, in the midst of this swaying and keeping distance, suddenly hit him in the cheekbones, the youth, who had not even tried to avoid him, much less deflect the blow, fell sluggishly to the ground. The people standing around the fence booed him. He managed to get up. His opponent bounded up to him and kicked his stomach hard. He managed to break his fall somewhat by stretching out his arms, but the liquid he had drunk suddenly surged from his stomach. When his opponent kicked him one more time, he fell forward and threw up the rest of it. The green liquid pooled on the ground and dirtied his mouth. For some reason, the crowd roared. Struggling, he got to his feet. This time, his opponent did not attack, but merely waited for him, swaying back and forth like before, watching him. The youth stared back at him. Having vomited, his insides felt much better. No more dizziness. A little more confident now, he swiftly swung a fist the next time his enemy approached. But the opponent was quicker. The young man with the fierce expression moved as if he were gliding on his feet, dodged into the youth's arm, and slammed the youth's throat with his thumb and forefinger. A quick but effective blow. The wind knocked out of him. The youth began to fall forward. His opponent, seizing the opportunity, sidestepped and made to jab the youth in the neck with his elbow. Right before the opponent's elbow struck, the youth heard the sound of rocks shattering and steel tearing. For some reason, it wasn't as painful as before. His opponent's elbow hit something unbelievably hard. The youth heard the sound of the young man's elbow joint breaking and his screams. The youth sprang to his feet. Reaching out with his right arm to attack, he saw that he still had a cuff on his wrist. So he lowered that arm and, with his left arm, grabbed his opponent's neck. The left arm stretching out before him was covered in something hard and glistening, like gray scales, and his hand and fingers looked like they were hewn from rock. That gray hand, looking nothing like a human's, was now wrapped around the ferocious-looking young man's neck and squeezing. All these things happened in what felt like a strange slowness. His hand holding up his opponent by his neck. The man's face looked fit to burst, at first turning red, then white, and soon, blue. The youth watched these changes like he were a spectator of the fight. From the opponent's side, an old man with white hair jumped into the arena. The bald man also came sprinting. This was the first time the youth had seen the bald man without a smile for him. He couldn't make out what the voices of the people shouting at him were saying, but following the orders of the bald man, he dropped his opponent. His fingers, oddly slow, loosened their grip one by one. His opponent, eyes rolled so far back in agony that the youth could only see the whites, whimpered as he collapsed to the ground. The white-haired old man kept shouting as he dragged the opponent out of the arena. Throughout all this, the audience was in a crazed frenzy, unintelligibly screaming. Alone in the arena now, the youth stood staring at the chaos outside the ring. The bald man came up to him again, grabbed his right hand, and raised his arm up. A thunderous roar from the crowd was accompanied by a pelting of small, shining objects into the arena. The man was all grins again as he picked up these sparkling pieces while the youth stared down at his own hands. They were back to being his normal hands. His arm was back to being what it used to be. But in that moment, he could finally connect the sounds of breaking, the bone-shattering pain, and the gray, stony scales that appeared from the triangular scars along his limbs and back and ribs. He couldn't quite explain what he had understood, but he had a feeling that a very big question of his had just been answered. The bald man stuffed into his hip pouch the small and sparkling bits and pieces that the people had thrown, and still had fistfuls in both hands as he led the youth out of the arena. In no time, the bald man's people had packed up their things, and they were on their way out of the village. Even as they made a run for it, the bald man was all smiles. At the inn where they arrived after a long day's journey, they unpacked in their rooms and then ate a large, jovial supper. On the luggage rack of their carriage tied outside, the youth dozed on a pile of straw. Something prodded him awake. The bald man was fastening a chain to the cuff on his right wrist and locking the chain to something above the youth's head. As the youth tried to get up, the man pressed down on his neck. The youth obediently sat back down. Holding out a bowl of something, the man said, "Drink." The youth lowered his head over the bowl to do so, but involuntarily turned away. It was something similar to the green stuff he had drunk that morning, but with an extra, sharper smell. The dizzy, nauseating feeling came back to him, and he frowned. Drink! The man grabbed his neck and shoved his face into the bowl. Listlessly, the youth tried to resist with his left arm. All that happened was the chain dangling from his right wrist clanged, an irritating sound. With all his might, the man grabbed the youth's neck with one hand and tilted the contents of the bowl into his mouth with the other, forcing him to finish it. Spasms rocked the youth and he coughed violently, but like before, half of it had already made it down his esophagus. The bald man looked down at him expressionlessly as the youth coughed and gagged. If you hadn't drunk that medicine before, you would have killed that bastard. Understand? This change in his tone was so abrupt, the youth looked up in wonder. You were lucky that little shit didn't die and we kept our money and got out of there. Think of what would have happened if you killed him. You'd be finished. Do you hear me? The youth kept looking up at him and didn't answer. The man's hand struck the side of the youth's face, hard. You hear me? He shouted again. Getting slapped out of nowhere made the youth angry, but he still couldn't move his body. His face flashed red, but all strength had left his limbs. Eat everything I give you from now on, right? Don't throw it up or get clever about it. Having spat out these last words, the man, teetering slightly, left the carriage and went back into the inn. 10. Ever since the bald man gave him the mysterious liquid to drink and made him fight men, the youth began to feel worse and worse. The strong smelling liquid no longer made him vomit so often, but the dizziness and nausea increased. Suppressing the vomit, he tended to be unsteady on his feet in the arena, making him more vulnerable to the blows that rained down upon him. His body was definitely deteriorating, which meant the speed in which he recovered from the effects of the liquid was slowing down. He knew, of course, that in the last moment, hard scales would sprout from the scars that it had left on him and protect his body from harm. But because he could not think straight, those defenses were slow to come into effect, and with the flagging of his strength and the battering his body was receiving, he could not fight back as hard as he could before. The day he faced a pale giant with an almost geometrically perfect smile, completely white skin, and red eyes, he thought he would finally die. The red-eyed giant, like a cat playing with a mouse, struck a blow on every part of the youth's body and whipped the crowd into a frenzy. Sometimes the giant would make an aggressive move and the youth would feebly try to counterattack, only to have the giant sidestep out of the way in the last second and bow to the applauding audience, the white giant's red eyes beaming with mirth and confidence. Just as the fight was beginning to seem endless, the giant attempted to strike the final blow on the teetering youth, who was near fainting. The youth would later remember that just then he sprouted black wing-like limbs from his back and whacked away the giant that had been lunging for the youth's throat. The giant's body flew out of the arena, and the audience roared with appreciation at this unexpected turn. The wing-like limbs disappeared in the next moment, and the youth felt the blood drain from his face as he began to keel over. Immediately, the bald man ran up to him and snatched his arm with one hand and propped up his back with the other so that he wouldn't fall. Holding the youth's arm up, the bald man bowed to the audience and gathered the coins that the audience was showering them with as the youth tried not to vomit or fall. The world was spinning, and his insides hurt like they were being twisted. In the carriage as they pulled out of the village, the bald man counted his coins and cackled. Yes, that's the spirit. Keep doing exactly what you did today. Looks like you've reached the end, and then bam! Those wings! How did you do that? What's your secret? Oh, who cares? Just keep doing what you're doing. The youth had no idea what the bald man was saying. He did not have the energy for comprehension or concentration. Whenever the carriage shook, his guts felt like they did a flip, and every beat of his heart gave him a pain that felt like something was swelling inside his head. That night, the youth stared at his right wrist, which was chained to the carriage's luggage compartment, and thought that he needed to escape once more. 11. It wasn't easy waiting for an opportunity. From morning until evening, the youth was surrounded by the bald man and his gang, and in the night they all slept together in the carriage. On days when he earned a lot of money, he was left alone in the carriage while the others went drinking, but his right wrist remained chained to the luggage compartment. More than anything else, however, he was getting weaker and weaker. He no longer had to drink the suspicious liquid in order to feel nauseous. Whenever he stood up after sitting for some time, or emerged from a dark place into an even slightly brighter one, the world would spin around him. During fights, he had now reached the point where he simply teetered for a while as his opponents landed blow after blow, before he fainted dead away to the boos of the crowd. This prompted the bald man to stop giving him the medicine, but his body had already been damaged, and even as he struggled and tried to choke down his vomit, he was continuously sent out to fight. It was when the youth could no longer stand up properly on his own that the bald man was finally finished with him. No matter how much the man hit or kicked him or pressed down on his neck, the youth could no longer rise. The bald man spat on him and had one of his underlings carry him over his shoulder into the hills. Once the underling had hacked through quite a bit of forest, he abandoned the youth under a tree and disappeared. The youth lay on the ground and stared up at the sky, a fragment of blue peeping through the dense covering of the trees. As he lay there and stared up at the unmoving blue fragment, inhaling the scent of fallen leaves, his endlessly rumbling nausea seemed to cease. A dreamy, relaxed feeling overcame him, where he lay completely still. The blue above him started to gray. It then turned ashen and rain began to fall. The leaves that covered the ground and his body were mercilessly pelted with fat raindrops. The rainwater was chilly against his skin. With the rain thickening and the smell of damp earth and leaves growing stronger, he was starting to feel nauseous again. He trembled and almost bounced off the ground as he suddenly sat up and violently vomited what felt like his entire insides. Mustering what little strength that was left in his battered body, he vomited for a long time until there was nothing inside him anymore. When he was done, he lifted his head and stared up at the sky where the rain was falling from. The raindrops hit his face and slid into his mouth. He drank them in. They were sweet and refreshing. He got to his feet. It was cold, but the shivers and the pain that had been strangling his guts were dissipating, and were soon gone entirely. Heading in the opposite direction of where the underling who had brought him here disappeared to, he started to walk. 12. The youth wandered the mountain forest for 4 days. Aside from rainwater and some grasses, he ate nothing and continued to walk for a long time. When he emerged from the forest on the evening of the 4th day and discovered a village, the first thought in his mind was not joy that he had survived, but that the village was somehow familiar to him. A rock near the village's entrance, the green-brown earth and gray-barked trees, and the row of houses all came together in an uncanny sense that he had been here before. But why the village scene was so familiar, or where he had seen it before, was something he didn't have the wherewithal to ponder. For 4 days straight, he had not eaten or slept properly. The things he needed most right now were food and warmth. He walked into the strangely familiar village. He still wore the clothes he had worn in the arena. The only thing on his body were the ornate, loose trousers they had given him, and he had no shoes or tunic, just the many scars marking his back and arms, bare to the world. The sun was melting into different shades of red above the clouds on the horizon, and smoke was rising from the village houses as their inhabitants prepared their evening meals. The smell of cooking made his stomach jump and skip. He walked into the alley between the houses. Villagers returning from their work stopped in their tracks and stared at him. In the tense silence of their fearful gazes, the youth remembered the day he had escaped it and the cave and come upon the world of people. But unlike back then, there was no grinning man coming up to run and grab his hand. No one offered him food or warmth. When he tried to enter the houses, the women would take one look at the scars on his ribcage and scream. Farmers holding hoes or rakes would chase him away, making angry faces. He was discouraged. He covered as many of his scars as he could with his arms and hurried out of there. Once he had escaped the village, he sighed. Should he go to the mountains? He had no clue as to how one survived in the mountains or the forest, how to light a fire, where to get food. He didn't even know where to start with such things. But he had managed to survive on raw meat and greens before. There was no reason why he couldn't continue to do so now. More than anything else, there was no telling what would happen to him if he ever found himself in a village again. He turned back to the darkening forest and began to walk. After walking a long time through the trees, in the darkness, he saw something like the round roof of a shelter. It really was a roof. Not only that, there was a whole house underneath it. But seeing how there was no lights inside despite the dark, he thought it must be abandoned. He was overjoyed. A place to sleep? While still hungry, Night had fallen, so he might as well spend the night here and go out to forage for food when the sun came up. He approached the hut and pushed open the door. The door made a creaking sound as it opened. From the darkness, a white object approached him. Surprised, he staggered backward and fell on his behind. Brother? Asked the white object. He didn't know what to say. 13. The woman stretched out her arm and fumbled around in the emptiness in front of her. Brother? She asked again. He tried to calm down. Slowly, he stood up. Brother? Why aren't you saying anything? The woman approached. Her fingers grazed his cheek. He froze. Without hesitation, the woman stepped up to him and caressed his face. He closed his eyes. The sweetest moment of his entire life ended with the woman's scream. Who are you? Her shout frightened him. The woman flailed at the space in front of her as she shouted, Why are you here? What happened to my brother? In the confusion, he grabbed the woman's thrashing wrists. The woman screamed. He turned her around and covered her mouth. As she struggled against him, he dragged her into the house. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the woman suddenly stopped struggling. He was so surprised that he stopped in his tracks, too. Let me go, the woman whispered. I won't scream. I'll do what you want. Just let me go. So he let her go. The woman carefully righted herself. She felt around with her hands and took a step away from him. So what do you want from me? She asked in a cold, low voice. What have you done to my brother? The youth did not know who this brother was. He wasn't there to harm her either. He wanted to explain this, but didn't know how, and he simply took a step closer to her. He tripped over something and lost his balance. In surprise, he shouted out, and through the darkness, something had struck the top of his head. He lost consciousness. 14. When he came to, it was bright all around him. He couldn't stand. His hands were tied behind his back. There was a young man in front of him. A familiar man, strangely enough. What are you doing here? Demanded the young man. What are you doing so far from the cave? And what were you going to do to my sister? Speak! The youth could not fully recognize either the young man or his sister. He hadn't come all the way here to do anything. He vigorously shook his head. The young man was not assuaged. His words and gaze became a shade harsher. That monster sent you, didn't it? Did it tell you to kill my sister? Or bring her to it? The word monster made his mind go white. The young man knew about it. How? The bald man, his gang, the inhabitants of all the villages he had passed by, none of them have ever mentioned it. Misinterpreting his blank expression, the young man threw a punch at his face. Speak, he shouted. Why are you here? What were you going to do with my sister? Not giving him a chance to answer, he punched the youth's face once more. From the inside of his lip, the youth felt a salty liquid pooling in his mouth. Answer me! The young man struck again. The youth's vision briefly went black. As he saw the young man's fist rise again, he desperately twisted his body and turned his head. More than being misunderstood as serving it, more than the surprise from meeting someone who knew what it was, he was infuriated by this fist that silenced him every time he was trying to answer. Brother, stop that. The two men turned their heads at the same time. It was then the youth noticed the woman's eyes. They were a translucent gray. Perhaps she hadn't been born this way, but a thin membrane had formed on her eyes and clouded her vision. He thought her eyes were beautiful. The woman was more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen before. If he's bad, all we need to do is chase him away. Don't hit him, she said gently. The young man sighed. All right, we'll get rid of him. He grabbed the youth by the neck and brought him to his feet. Then he dragged the youth outside. The youth kept looking back at the woman. With a worried expression, she faced the impenetrable space before her, staring with her gray eyes. The young man dragged the youth out of the house and all the way to the forest path. There, he released his bonds and kicked him, making him stumble onto the ground. As the youth tried to find his balance, the young man kicked him in the stomach. Tell that monster, said the young man as he watched the youth writhe in pain on the ground, that my sister is off limits. I don't know what is going on, but my sister will never be a part of that. And the young man turned to go back to his house. The youth grabbed his ankle. Turning, the young man kicked the youth in the face. Coughing, the youth collapsed once more and spat out the blood that pooled in his mouth. But when the young man turned toward home again, the youth grabbed his ankle once more. In truth, the man was frightened, but he didn't kick the youth this time. Instead, he stared down as if there was something he hadn't noticed before. What is wrong with you? The youth carefully looked up at the young man. He gestured, putting food in his mouth. You want food? The youth nodded. Nonplussed, the young man gave a snort of laughter, and he lifted his foot to trample the youth again. The youth covered his head with his hands, but didn't make to escape. He lay there before the young man in the most self denigrating pose possible, beseeching him. Are you a fool? You come to our house looking for a sacrifice, and now you want to be fed? Looking up, the youth vigorously shook his head. He made eating gestures with his hands again. The young man looked down at him for a long time. Maybe you really are a fool. The only answer the youth could give him was to keep miming eating. The young man roughly brought the youth to his feet. We're only doing this once, he said, as he dragged him along. Just once. When you've eaten, leave. Go far away and never come back. 15. The youth never strayed far from the house the gray-eyed woman and her brother lived in. When the woman brought him food, he gobbled it up quickly. Her brother took him to the shed after his meal. Without any explanation, as if there were no need for any, the brother attached a chain to the youth's right cuff and fastened it tightly to a rafter of the shed using a heavy lock. Don't think you can do whatever you like with us. The brother left. In the morning, the brother came back and released him, but the youth sat lingering in the shed. Only when the brother tried to shoo him away did he mime with his hands and feet that he had nowhere else to go. When the brother became angry and used his fists, the youth didn't try to avoid the blows. He fell to the ground and acted as pitifully as possible, begging to stay with them. Tell me the truth. Where are you from? At this question, all the youth could do was shake his head as hard as he could. Why are you here? What do you plan to do to my sister? He was struck with blows along with each question, but all the youth did was shake his head. The brother became convinced he was at least partially a fool. At first, the youth mostly sat in the shed. Then one day, the brother dragged him out of it. Instead of his thin, outlandish trousers, he was given a thick, practical pair, along with a tunic, and taken to the forest. Of his elaborate costume, or the cuff on his right wrist, the brother never asked a thing. He followed the brother around, gathering mushrooms and fruit. The brother hunted small animals as well. The youth knew nothing about hunting or anything else that was the slightest bit useful in putting food on the table. And because he was bad at everything, he was regularly beaten by the brother. Even as he was beaten and insulted, he never tried to avoid the blows or escape. He did know one thing, and that was which greens were edible. He presented whatever fragrant herb he found to the woman along with the mushrooms and fruit. The woman avoided him and generally tried to keep her distance, but when he offered these gifts, she seemed at least a little pleased. On the rare occasions the brother was in a good mood while they foraged, he talked to the youth or even hummed a song. The youth nodded along or shook his head to communicate his understanding. In the evenings, after dinner, the brother would take him back to the shed and chain him up as a matter of course, locking the shed behind him. The youth obediently did as he was told by the brother. The brother hadn't noticed this, but there was a gap at the end of the rafter he was chained to, which meant the youth could jiggle his chain off at the end of it. Even after the youth had slipped the chain out and released his right-hand cuff, he never left the shed. Instead, he wandered around, looking at the stack of hay, the ropes, planks, and various farming implements he hadn't an inkling on how to use. One evening, he overheard from outside the shed's window the woman and her brother talking about him. We can't keep him forever in that shed like some beast, said the woman. He escaped from the monster, said the man in an ominous voice. He must never be sheltered inside the house, and we can't keep him in the shed for too long either. He escaped from the monster? How do you know? Look at his scars. What else engraves such scars on its sacrifices? The youth felt his breath knocked out of him, but he tried not to utter a sound as he continued to eavesdrop. He's either here to bring back a sacrifice to replace himself, or he's out for revenge. Either way, it doesn't bode well for us. Then what are we to do? asked the woman in a trembling voice. Don't worry. Even animals like that have their use in this world. I know someone who will take him somewhere far away. Who is that? Where would he take him? The woman asked in a worried voice. That's for me to know. You don't have to trouble yourself with that knowledge. It's late. We should go back inside. That was the end of the conversation. The youth finally realized why the brother seemed so familiar to him. When he had escaped from the cave and arrived at the first village he had found, and the bald man had come to get him, the brother was the young man who had been talking to the bald one. He could not return to fighting in the arenas. He would not last long. But he had to know. What was this monster? And why did it need sacrifices? And why had he been selected for that sacrifice? While he was mulling these questions over, the door of the shed creaked open. Wordlessly, the gray-eyed woman entered. 16. The youth was so surprised that he stood there without making a sound. Then he realized he had released the chain her brother had tied to him without permission. Quickly, he dashed back to where he was supposed to be and tried to sling the chain back on the rafter. It made a sound loud as it fell to the ground instead. He was picking it up when he remembered that the woman was blind. Are you there? The woman smiled. He nodded but then realized she could not see and chastised himself inwardly. Instead, he moved the chain so it made a sound. Did you really escape from the monster? He pulled at the chain again. It reverberated loudly in the shed. Are you here to exact your revenge on me, then? He couldn't understand her. All he could do was stare into her gray, pupilless eyes. You were sacrificed to the monster in my stead, weren't you? He was becoming more and more confused. Understanding nothing, he continued to look into her white face. The woman took a step towards him. Before he could move away, she gently placed a hand on his wrist. Her fingers were long and slender and soft. He remembered how her hand had felt as it caressed his face when he first came here, how she had mistaken him for her brother. Please sit, she said. I will tell you everything. 17. Once upon a time. All legends start this way. Once upon a time, there was a place plagued by a disease every few years. The disease was thought to be from a monster that lived in the highest cave of the highest mountain in that region, a monster resembling a large crow, which flew down once every few years when it was hungry to devour the crops and trees. The villagers believed it exhaled poison whenever it opened its mouth, which meant any person or animal in its vicinity would get sick and die. They decided to prevent the monster from getting hungry and coming out of its cave by giving it a sacrifice. According to a sorcerer, the best sacrifice was a prepubescent child. Whenever the air became tepid and the people and beasts of the village began to fall ill, the people left a child in the cave on the mountain. This practice persisted, and even when there was no plague, when someone was sick, the villagers sometimes took a child that had no family to the cave and prayed for the afflicted to get better. It was not a plague year, but I was born with a sickness, the woman said in a soft voice. I became blind from it. If nothing had been done for me, the disease would have spread all over my body. I would have become deaf and mute, unable to move on my own, unable to breathe, ended up having to die a torturous death, at least, according to the sorcerer. Her voice became even softer. So my father and brother found and kidnapped an orphan child from outside the village and sacrificed him to the cave. She whispered, Was that you? He had no answer. The woman waited. Because he said nothing, she asked, Are you still there? He barely managed to give the chain a shake. The woman said, I did not know such things had been done. I only learned later, when I heard others talking. I was a child myself, but to learn that another child had been killed to save me, that has always been a great source of sadness. He made no sound. Softly, the woman spoke again. After sacrificing the child, my father died in an accident a short while later. I thought that was the revenge the sacrificed child had taken on our family, but the real person who deserved to die was me. The youth stroked the chain and could only gaze at the woman silently. So, if you want revenge, do whatever you want. She stopped talking. They sat in silence. The woman spoke again. Are you still there? He threw the chain to the ground, wrapped the woman's white face in his hands, and kissed her lips. 18. The next morning, the woman's brother opened the door to the shed to find her sitting alone, in tears. He's gone to kill the monster, she said through her sobs. He said it wasn't my fault, that I did nothing wrong, that what made the people sick in both body and soul, that what made them harm the children of others was the monster, that he must therefore kill the monster, that he would kill the monster. The brother took his sister in his arms and consoled her before taking her back to the house. Of the news he just heard, he didn't know whether to be joyful or dread what was coming to the village. 19. Relying on old memories, the youth made his way up the mountain. The words he had heard from the woman echoed endlessly in his head. An orphan child from outside the village. He was a little crestfallen with those words. But if the woman's brother had been there when he had been kidnapped, he could at least learn where he'd been found and under what circumstances. From that scrap of knowledge, he might be able to find his home, his parents, maybe even his name. But that didn't help him think of a way to kill it. He hadn't set out with a clear plan. But then again, never in his life had he made a plan or had an inkling as to what to do. To not be caught and consumed by it, to survive somehow and return. Just like when he was trapped in the cave before, survival was his objective and plan. And that was what he vowed when he stood at the mouth of the cave. He entered. 20. Because he was used to the light of the sun outside, the complete darkness of the cave briefly disoriented him. He slowly began feeling his way forward. How strange a person's fate was. When she was little, the woman had an older brother and a father, a family that worried over her health, a home, a life. All that had been granted to the youth was this damp, moldy cave and its hard rocks, the handcuffs and manacles on a chain, and a stake attached to that chain. Every person has only one childhood, and instead of being full of hopes or dreams, his had been crushed by the fight for survival. He never once imagined in all his years spent in the cave that a different childhood from the one that had been accorded to him might have been possible. And now that he was back inside the cave, senses that had long been dormant revived inside him. The cave was his world, and whether he liked to or not, he remembered every wrinkle in the rock and rise or depression in the floor. If he was this used to it, perhaps he himself was part of this cave. Just as he was thinking this, his hand touched the iron stake. From the woman's shed, the youth had brought the chain that the woman's brother had linked to his right cuff. Now that he had arrived in the prison of his childhood, he crouched down next to the stake like he used to. This was his place, and it had been kept empty for him. If he were lucky, no one would ever have to take his place. The distant white spot that was the cave's entrance was blocked by a huge black form. The youth lifted his chin and stared into the dark. Never while he lived in the cave did he manage to see what it looked like. Back then, it would appear suddenly, blocking the entrance of the cave, and in the next moment, it would be on the youth's back, crushing his limbs with its wings and talons, piercing him between his bones with its sharp beak. Like previous times, it tried to climb on his back. Realizing that the youth was not a child and was wearing clothes, it, as if mocking him, ripped away at his tunic. The talons slicing through his flesh as well as his garments made him want to scream, but he held his silence. It never pierced him in the same place twice. There were scars along his back, limbs, and ribs where it had violated him before, and if it wanted to find an unsoiled spot, it would have to spend some time looking. The youth was counting on that moment. It finished ripping off his tunic, pressed down on his neck, and positioned its beak. The youth, tense with the fear of what might happen next, briefly closed his eyes. As expected, it saw the scars on his neck and drew back its beak. As it followed the scars down his back and along his arms and ribs, it tried to rip his trousers. The youth twisted his upper body and swung the chain connected to his right handcuff. In the dark, the chain made a heavy, threatening sound as it whipped through the damp air and smashed against an unseen object. The youth couldn't tell what it had hit, but he had heard a hard, clear shattering sound and a scream that shook the interior of the cave, followed by a hideous smell. Aiming right below the source of the odor, he swung his chain once more. The resulting scream almost deafened him as it shook the walls, and in the very next moment, his chain was wrapped around a talon, and he went flying through the air. It was beautiful. He couldn't help thinking so when, for the first time, he could clearly see it by the light of the sun. It was truly monstrously beautiful. In the sunlight, it was not black, but dark gray. Its ashen feathers gleamed like well-forged iron, a cold and lifeless sheen. Its talons and beak were silver, and in the middle of that silver beak was a short but deep red gash. The youth surmised this was where his chain had hit. Beside the beak was an icy blue eye staring down at him. That shade of blue, to someone seeing it for the first time, was shockingly deep and clear and cruel. He wound his chain tighter around its feet and tried to hoist himself up. But one of the links of the chain he dangled from came into contact with the sharp talons and was sliced into two. Even if he survived the fall like the time he escaped from it, there would be no point in having come all this way if he let it fly off to somewhere far away. He desperately clung onto the silver claws of it and tried to climb up on the monster without getting scratched. Just then, it lowered its head and bit down on him. When he felt the steely beak close down from his rib cage to his legs, he was certain he was about to die. But it did not swallow him or shake him off into the air. As painful as it was, he wasn't being bitten down on strong enough for his bones to break. This could only mean it was trying to take him somewhere. The minute he thought this, it tossed him into the air and caught him again in its beak. Now the youth lay on his back, facing the sky and staring straight into the blue eye of it. If beasts could show emotion in their eyes, the emotion that the youth would have discerned at that moment would have clearly been one of satisfaction. But being different from people, beasts do not derive satisfaction from scaring or torturing others. The question they ask of any other animal is whether it will kill or be killed by it. As long as they can prevent themselves from being killed while having prey in their grasp, animals don't need to concern themselves with the feelings of their prey. Simply the fact of having prey in their grasp is enough satisfaction. It made a wide arc in the air. It was flying back to the cave. Without hesitation, the youth swung his right arm hard. The chain connected to his right cuff smashed directly into the icy blue eye of it, and the half-sliced link gave way, leaving a fragment of the chain lodged in the eye. It gave out a shriek that shook heaven and earth as it banked to one side. In its sudden, blind pain, it darted toward a cliff on the mountain where the cave was and crashed. 21. He couldn't understand how he was still alive. But buried as he was in broken branches, scattered leaves, grasses, and brambles, his breath still hadn't left his body. As he tried to get up, he felt a jolt through the right side of his body. He couldn't move his right leg. Grabbing one of the thicker branches around him, he used it as a crutch to slowly and carefully stand up. The behemoth had crashed against the cliff and broken its neck. Its eyes were devoid of life. Its giant beak still gleamed silver in the light. A wingspan wide enough to wrap over the ridge of the mountain, but the stiff feathers were so clumped and crushed that they looked like rough cloth. He stood still and stared at the dead bird. The bird was dead, and it would never steal again, nor would anything be stolen from it. The only evidence the bird ever existed would be the scars on the youth's body from when he had been its prey. A realization that somehow saddened the youth. Without knowing why, he found himself wishing the bird would revive, that it hadn't died so easily, as he stood there and gazed into its blue eye. Then, he began to limp back towards the village where the woman was waiting. 22. Dusk was settling by the time he arrived at the village. The red sun had fragmented, and its pieces were dissolving into the spaces between the iridescent clouds, a sight that he would never tire of. He took the path through the village and began walking up to the forest and the mountains beyond. There were no lights seen from the road. The woman's brother had gone out to the forest and hadn't returned, and the woman was blind, so she didn't need the light. That was what he told himself as he hurried his pace. At the threshold of the hut, before he opened the door, he called out the woman's name. He didn't want to barge in and surprise her. No sounds came from within. He pushed open the hut door. The woman had been sitting at the table, and she stood up as she heard the door open. Approaching him, she held out her hand. In his gladness to see her, he also reached out for her hand. The moment his fingertips brushed hers, the woman transformed into thousands of water droplets and scattered into thin air. 23. Overwhelmed by what had just happened, he stood frozen by the door, his hand still stretched out for hers. Behind him, a cry as if from a beast. He turned. The woman's brother charged at him with a hunting knife. The youth sidestepped just in time. He tried to explain, but the brother did not want to listen. In truth, the youth did not understand what had happened either. The brother's momentum carried him past the youth. He turned and rushed at the youth again while uttering his cry. The youth grabbed the man's arm and gripped his wrist, trying to make him drop the knife, but it was impossible to overpower the man, who was filled with mad strength. No matter how much the youth resisted, the man's blade inched towards his neck. Its tip touched him. The youth felt it pierce his skin and blood beginning to flow. And in that moment, the youth saw his hand that was gripping the man's wrist was turning into a steely gray. The man's wrist began bending back in an impossible angle. White bone popped out from his skin. The man screamed and fell to the floor, clutching his broken arm. The youth stared down at the man. Incandescent rage had vanished from the man's eyes. They were soon flooded with fear. That was the last thing the youth remembered. 24. When he came to again, it was morning. The woman and her brother's hut had vanished without a trace. Where the shed had once stood were what looked like the man's scattered remains, along with oceans of blood. Finding it unbearable to look at, he turned his head and quickly left the scene. When he came down the mountain to the village, he saw that it was in ruins. Where yesterday there had been houses and people passing by, now stood an old tree, hundreds of years old, standing there as it had since time immemorial. Where there had once been a fence thick with vines and a blacksmith's, was now just a field of dried grass. The inhabitants were almost all gone. 2 or 3 stragglers, wandering the scene with dazed expression, took one look at him, turned white with fear, and disappeared from his sight. He despaired. He hadn't wanted revenge, at least not this kind of revenge. He simply had not known the village's survival had hinged solely on the existence of it. The absurdity of the conclusion made him feel helpless. The strangers who stole his childhood with their sorcerer and belief, the despondent life he had lived on the brink of death, it had all been meaningless in the end. Mourning his years of suffering and despair, he stood there in the ruins of the village and wept. And once his tears had finally ceased, he began to walk towards the rising sun in search of that place in this world where his life was waiting for him.